Texas, late autumn of 1944. The sky stretched wide and amber, painted with slow-moving clouds that caught the last fire of the setting sun. Dust rolled across the plains as a line of army trucks approached the remote barbed wire perimeter of Camp Swift, just east of Austin. The vehicles came to a halt near the guard tower, their engines sighing into silence. Inside the trucks sat several dozen Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and civilian aides captured in the Pacific Theater. Their uniforms were faded, their faces drawn from long weeks aboard a ship that had crossed half the world. Some still clutched medical satchels, others photographs pressed flat between fingers. They had been prisoners for months, but this landscape, endless sky, open pastures, and the smell of dry grass felt otherworldly. The guards, mostly young Texans in khaki, approached without hurry. Their accents carried across the field, slow and respectful. The women, uncertain, stepped down one by one. They expected indifference, maybe contempt. Instead, they were met with quiet order and simple courtesy. As night fell, the prisoners were led toward their new quarters, neat rows of wooden barracks beside a pasture where horses grazed under the moonlight. In the distance, faint music drifted from a nearby ranch where off-duty soldiers gathered by a campfire. The tune, a steel guitar, low and melancholy, carried over the fence line, blending with the chirr of crickets and the crackle of burning mesquite. Later that evening, a small group of guards approached the camp's edge. They invited the nurses to join them by the fire. It was an unheard-of gesture, one that crossed the invisible line between enemy and host. The nurses hesitated, glancing at each other in disbelief. But when they arrived, they found mugs of coffee waiting, a place by the flames, and the easy warmth of men who tipped their hats and said, simply, "Ma'am." For a moment, the war receded. The campfire became a fragile island of peace, a place where captors and captives shared the same flickering light. No one spoke of battles, or surrender, or loss. Only the sound of horses shifting in the dark, the slow strum of a guitar, and the faint realization that even here, in wartime Texas, humanity could still be offered with a word of respect. That night would linger in memory long after the barbed wire came down. It was not written in reports or military orders, but in the recollections of women who never forgot that a group of American cowboys, rough-handed and sunburned, had treated them with dignity when the world had not. And from that small act of kindness would unfold a larger story of how two cultures, once bound by conflict, would briefly meet on the same ground under a Texas sky. The year was 1944, a turning point in the Second World War. Across the Pacific, Japan's empire, once vast and unyielding, was collapsing under the weight of Allied advances. Islands that had once served as fortresses, Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines, fell one by one. What began as a war of conquest had become a desperate fight for survival. Amid this chaos were thousands of Japanese nurses, doctors, and medics, women who had volunteered or been conscripted to serve in field hospitals from the jungles of New Guinea to the volcanic ridges of the Marianas. Many were not soldiers by trade. They were students, midwives, and caregivers who had been swept into the war's current. Their role was to tend to the wounded, to preserve life even as destruction engulfed everything around them. When American forces captured entire hospitals intact during the Pacific campaigns, the medical personnel were taken prisoner. Under international law, nurses and medical staff were to be treated as non-combatants, a principle upheld, though rarely without tension, by both sides. Some were interned in makeshift island compounds. Others were transported across oceans to the United States for long-term detention. It was an extraordinary reversal of fate. From the ruins of the Pacific to the far plains of America, women who had once served the emperor found themselves thousands of miles from home, behind fences watched by men in cowboy hats. By mid-1944, the U.S. War Department had constructed over 500 prisoner-of-war camps across the country. Texas alone held more than 50, scattered from the Gulf Coast to the Panhandle. Its warm climate, open land, and rural isolation made it ideal for housing tens of thousands of Axis prisoners, Germans, Italians, and a smaller number of Japanese. Among these installations stood Camp Swift, near Bastrop, one of the largest training and internment facilities in the Southwest. Initially built for infantry and armored divisions, it expanded to include compounds for prisoners transferred from the Pacific. Though the majority were male soldiers, a select group of medical personnel, including Japanese nurses, were sent here under careful watch. The arrival of female prisoners in Texas was a quiet, almost unreported event. Newspaper editors avoided the subject, and official bulletins reduced them to simple statistics: civilian medical internees. Yet to those stationed at the camp, the presence of Japanese women among the barbed wire was something unexpected, a reminder that the war's reach extended into every human corner. The local Texans who served as guards were not career soldiers. Many were ranch hands, students, and volunteers from small towns scattered across the hill country. They came from a world of open doors and unhurried courtesy, a culture that prized respect, especially toward women. The sight of Japanese nurses, worn and silent, challenged every stereotype they had been taught about the enemy. To the nurses, Texas itself seemed unreal. The land was wide and empty, the air dry and scented with cedar and dust. There were no air raids, no hunger, no thunder of artillery, only the distant cry of cattle and the creak of wind through mesquite branches. They had been told they would be treated as prisoners, yet their captors offered them fresh clothes, clean water, and food served with a ma'am. It was a small word, but to them it carried weight. The Geneva Convention had set the tone, but it was the unspoken code of the American South that shaped their daily life. The guards addressed them formally, often tipping their hats in greeting. Within weeks, a quiet rhythm developed inside the compound: routine medical duties, gardening, laundry, and the occasional sound of laughter as someone attempted to mimic a cowboy's drawl. Still, beneath that surface of calm, the realities of war remained. Letters to Japan were slow and heavily censored. The women had no way of knowing whether their families had survived the bombings. The guards, too, bore their own burdens. Many had lost brothers in the Pacific or Europe. And yet, somehow, inside this strange bubble of civility, hostility softened. The war beyond the fences raged on. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the firebombing of Tokyo, the gathering storm that would end in Hiroshima. But here, in the dry heart of Texas, a quieter story was unfolding, one that would reveal as much about the human spirit as any battle report or military chronicle. This was where two worlds, East and West, enemy and ally, briefly intersected not through combat, but through simple acts of decency. And at the center of it all stood the women whose presence would challenge every notion of enmity and honor. Soon, those quiet evenings by the campfire would take on a meaning far greater than anyone could have imagined. Because what began as a gesture of courtesy, an invitation to share warmth under the stars, would become a rare moment of connection between two sides divided by oceans and war. At Camp Swift, daily life followed a quiet rhythm. The Japanese nurses rose at dawn, lined up for roll call, and moved through their routines, cleaning the infirmary, checking bandages, tending to the small vegetable gardens that grew between barracks. They were efficient, disciplined, and dignified, traits that impressed the American guards, many of whom had never met a Japanese person before. To the nurses, the guards' mannerisms seemed both foreign and strangely gentle. The Texans were tall, sunburned men who carried themselves with a kind of casual respect. They tipped their hats when addressing the women, spoke softly, and used "ma'am" as if it were a sacred word. For the first few weeks, the nurses responded with silence, polite, reserved, cautious. They had been taught to expect humiliation from their captors. Yet the humiliation never came. Instead, the guards offered courtesy, even humor. One afternoon, a cowboy from San Angelo noticed a nurse struggling with a bucket at the camp's well. Without thinking, he stepped forward to help. She froze, a prisoner unaccustomed to aid from a guard. He simply nodded and said, "Evenin', ma'am." That single gesture, simple, ordinary, became the first crack in the wall between them. The nurses soon learned that Texas, for all its ruggedness, had its own codes of honor. The Cowboys' world was built on manners, pride, and quiet strength, a kind of Bushido born from the frontier rather than the samurai class. They respected labor, valued loyalty, and treated women, no matter their origin, with old-fashioned courtesy. At first, the Japanese women mistook it for condescension. But over time, they recognized something deeper, a shared sense of discipline and decorum that transcended culture. When a nurse bowed in thanks, the guards instinctively tipped their hats in return. Two gestures, different in form, identical in spirit. Camp Swift became an unlikely classroom of cultural exchange. The nurses taught the guards how to fold origami cranes from scrap paper. The Texans, in turn, showed them how to lasso fence posts and identify constellations in the clear Texas sky. For a few hours each evening, the war seemed far away, replaced by laughter that floated across the camp like the sound of wind in dry grass. Behind the human connection lay the machinery of wartime logistics. The Japanese nurses had been captured during the Mariana Islands campaign, taken when American forces overran a field hospital on Saipan in mid-1944. Rather than detain them in temporary Pacific facilities, U.S. authorities transferred them to the mainland, both for security and study. The office of the Provost Marshal General oversaw the relocation. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel were classified as retained rather than prisoners, meaning they could work within their professional capacities while under supervision. At Camp Swift, the nurses were assigned to assist in caring for wounded Axis prisoners, Germans and Italians recovering in nearby compounds. It was a quiet irony of war, Japanese nurses treating German soldiers on American soil, while American medics watched over them all. These duties, though simple, allowed the women to maintain a sense of purpose. Many had lost faith in the cause of the empire but not in their calling to heal. For them, caring for the injured was an act beyond nationality, a duty of humanity itself. It was in this atmosphere of subdued coexistence that the first campfire gathering occurred. The idea came from the guards themselves. They had noticed the nurses lingering near the fence at dusk, watching the cowboys as they strummed guitars and roasted beans over open flames. One evening, a sergeant suggested inviting them over, a gesture of goodwill, nothing more. Permission was quietly granted. The nurses, though hesitant, agreed. That night, they stepped beyond the wire for the first time since arriving in Texas. They sat on logs around the fire, wrapped in army blankets, while the cowboys played slow songs that rose into the stillness of the prairie night. The women, unsure how to respond, listened in silence. Then one began to hum a Japanese lullaby. Her voice was soft but steady, the melody ancient, mournful, and beautiful. The music wove through the firelight, Japanese and American tunes crossing like shadows. No one spoke the same language, yet everyone understood. When the song ended, the cowboys removed their hats. One of them said quietly, "Ma'am, that's the prettiest thing I ever heard." It was not recorded in any report. No photograph captured it. But every witness would remember it. War strips people of identity, yet within Camp Swift, something rare emerged, mutual recognition. The nurses were still prisoners, but they were no longer treated as faceless enemies. The cowboys, in turn, began to question the simplicity of wartime propaganda. Many of these guards had lost friends in the Pacific. They had seen newsreels portraying Japanese forces as fanatical and cruel. But sitting across the campfire from women who bowed politely and spoke softly of their families forced them to rethink those images. One guard later recalled that he had never seen respect so quiet or pride so controlled. The nurses refused pity. They accepted courtesy but never begged for lenience. That quiet dignity left an impression stronger than any battlefield victory. The camp became, in an unspoken way, a sanctuary. The nurses found small freedoms within the fences, the chance to work, to laugh, to touch the world again after months of fear. The cowboys, too, found something healing in their presence. In treating the enemy with humanity, they reclaimed a part of themselves that war had nearly erased. Each night, the campfire returned, a ritual that blurred the lines between captor and captive. Sometimes the women brought rice cakes made from camp rations. Sometimes the cowboys shared stories of rodeos and open ranges. They could not understand each other's words, but they understood tone, kindness, humility, gratitude. By the winter of 1945, the news of Japan's nearing defeat reached even the Texas plains. The atmosphere shifted. The nurses grew quieter, their eyes distant. Yet the guards treated them no differently. Respect had long since replaced suspicion. And so, when the war finally ended and the order for repatriation came, parting felt strangely painful on both sides. By the summer of 1945, the war was drawing to its terrible close. News traveled slowly to the prisoners, carried by radio broadcasts and whispers from camp officers. The nurses of Camp Swift listened in silence as word came of the firebombing of Tokyo, of Okinawa's fall, and finally, in August, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war that had sent them halfway around the world had ended not with surrender, but with annihilation. The women gathered in their quarters, eyes lowered, unable to grasp the enormity of what had happened. Their homeland, the place that had once seemed eternal, was gone in a haze of smoke and ash. Some wept quietly into their sleeves. Others stared out the windows toward the plains, where the wind carried the faint scent of rain. For the Americans at Camp Swift, victory came without celebration. They had grown accustomed to these women. Their presence had become a part of the landscape. They had seen the humanity of their former enemies, and now victory felt hollow. When the official order arrived, Japanese civilian medical personnel to be repatriated immediately, the guards knew what it meant. The women would be transported to the coast within days, placed aboard a naval vessel bound for Yokohama. Their time in Texas was ending. That evening, the cowboys built one last fire. It wasn't a ceremony nor an official farewell, just an unspoken gathering under the same wide Texas sky that had watched them all for months. The nurses were escorted to the fence line, then, at the guards' quiet insistence, through the gate. For once, the rules seemed to bend. The wind blew soft through the mesquite. The fire crackled low. A cowboy poured coffee into tin cups and handed them out. "Ma'am," he said, as always, tipping his hat. The women sat in silence at first. Some smiled shyly, others stared into the flames, their faces flickering between light and shadow. One of the younger nurses, no more than 20, began to hum again, the same tune she had sung months before. Slowly, another joined in and another. The sound carried across the fire, mingling with the rustle of dry grass and the distant call of an owl. The cowboys listened, heads bowed, hats in their hands. No one spoke of war. No one mentioned victory or loss. There was only the song, soft, haunting, and full of the weight of everything that had passed between them. When the melody ended, the camp fell still. The sergeant who had first invited them to the fire finally spoke. His voice was quiet, steady. "You'll go home soon," he said. "You'll see your people again. Tell them we treated you right." The interpreter translated. The women bowed deeply, some through tears. One of them looked up and replied in halting English, her voice trembling, "Called us, ma'am. We never forget." The words hung in the air like an oath. At dawn, the trucks arrived. The nurses climbed aboard, their belongings packed neatly in army-issued canvas bags. The cowboys stood in formation by the gate, hats pressed to their chests. The engines rumbled to life, kicking up dust that caught the morning sun. Through the haze, the women waved, small gestures from behind the truck's wooden slats. One of the cowboys lifted his hat high in the air and shouted, "Safe travels, ma'am." It was half farewell, half blessing. The nurses smiled, their faces streaked with tears and dust. Then the convoy rolled away down the dirt road, shrinking into the horizon until it was gone. Silence fell over Camp Swift. The barbed wire still gleamed in the morning light, but something had changed. The war had ended, yet for those who had lived through that fragile peace inside the fences, it had left behind something neither side expected: understanding. In the logbook, the departure was recorded with bureaucratic precision. Japanese civilian internees, departed, repatriated. No mention of campfires or music or the word ma'am. Yet in the memories of those who had been there, that night remained, a flicker of humanity that had survived the firestorm of war. When the trucks carrying the Japanese nurses left Camp Swift, the war in the Pacific had been over for less than a month. Japan lay in ruins. Entire cities had vanished beneath ash and twisted metal. Yet amid the devastation, ships arrived bearing repatriated civilians, nurses, medics, and prisoners who stepped onto the docks of Yokohama to a homeland they scarcely recognized. For many of the women who had spent those months in Texas, the return was not triumphant. They came back thinner, older, and uncertain of where they belonged. The government that had once commanded their loyalty no longer existed. The flags they had saluted had been lowered. Families were scattered, homes destroyed. Yet within their stories, fragments of Texas remained. In post-war interviews collected by the International Red Cross and Japanese repatriation authorities, several women described their captivity with quiet astonishment. They spoke of open skies, wide fields, and men who removed their hats when they approached. One wrote in her report, "We were treated not as enemies, but as women. They said, 'ma'am.' It was a small word, but it changed how I saw them and us." Those memories stood in sharp contrast to the devastation they found upon return. While most Japanese civilians endured hardship, the nurses carried an unusual burden: the kindness they had received from their captors. In a society rebuilding from defeat, their accounts were often met with disbelief or discomfort. They rarely spoke of it publicly. But in letters, diaries, and the quiet spaces of memory, the Texas campfire lingered. For the Americans, too, the experience left an imprint. Many of the guards, young men from rural Texas, returned home to ranches, schools, and small-town lives. They seldom spoke of the war, but those who had served at Camp Swift remembered the Japanese women differently from the soldiers they had guarded elsewhere. One former sergeant, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled, "They carried themselves with dignity, even behind wire. We were supposed to see them as the enemy. But after a while, you couldn't. They were just people trying to get through it." Another said, "I'll never forget when one of them bowed and said thank you. That's when I realized we'd both been taught wrong about each other." Camp Swift itself returned to quiet use after the war. The barracks were dismantled, the fences torn down. The land reverted to farmland and forest. Only fragments remained, foundations buried in soil, bits of rusted wire caught in mesquite roots. But for a time, it had been something rare, a crossroads where two nations met not through violence, but through shared humanity. In Japan, a few of the former nurses went on to become teachers and midwives during the post-war recovery. Their experiences in Texas subtly shaped how they viewed America in the years to come. When U.S. occupation forces arrived, some of those same women volunteered as medical assistants for the American Red Cross, citing their ability to understand American ways. One of them, decades later, told her granddaughter a story that had never appeared in any textbook. The Americans had horses. Wild ones. They called them Mustangs. They taught us how to ride, to hold the reins softly. They said, "Don't fight the horse, guide it." I thought about that all my life. Maybe peace is like that too. In Texas, the memory faded into local legend. Old ranchers would speak of the time Japanese nurses came through Bastrop, a story that sounded almost mythical to those who hadn't lived it. A few photographs survived in military archives: women in khaki standing beside jeeps, a row of nurses tending a garden inside a camp fence. But there were no images of that night by the fire. That moment lived only in the memories of those who had felt its warmth. By the 1970s, the story resurfaced briefly when a Japanese journalist visited Bastrop County, tracing the path of wartime camps. He interviewed one of the surviving guards, who told him quietly, "They were strangers, but we couldn't treat them like enemies. It just didn't feel right." The journalist published a small article titled, "Where Enemies Shared a Fire." It went largely unnoticed, but for those who read it, it captured something enduring, a reminder that war, even at its harshest, cannot erase the simple decency of one human being toward another. And though the barbed wire rusted away and the camp faded into history, the memory of that respect, the word ma'am, spoken across boundaries of culture and conflict, would remain as proof that dignity can survive even the deepest divides of war. War often leaves behind ruins, cities turned to ash, fields sown with silence. Yet, within that devastation, it sometimes leaves smaller, quieter things too: gestures, memories, moments that survive long after flags have changed hands. The story of the Japanese nurses at Camp Swift is one of those small miracles. It never appeared in textbooks, nor in official military histories. It existed between the lines, in the pauses of memory, in the unrecorded kindness of ordinary people. There were no medals for it, no monuments built to remember it. But perhaps that is what gives it power. It was simple, human, and profoundly decent. The nurses came to Texas as captives of war, weary, broken, and stripped of identity. The men who guarded them were products of another world, raised on dust, cattle, and the unspoken code of Southern respect. When those two worlds met, the rules of war said one thing, but the human heart said another. What the nurses found in those cowboys was not pity, but regard. A recognition of their dignity. A word, ma'am, that carried across language and enemy lines. And what the cowboys found in the nurses was something equally unexpected: humility, grace, and the quiet strength of women who had endured everything yet still carried themselves with poise. In the grand sweep of World War II, their encounter changed nothing on the map. No battles were won, no treaties signed. But for those who were there, it changed everything about how they understood the enemy and themselves. Perhaps that is where the true legacy of this story lies. Not in victory or defeat, but in the fragile moments when humanity asserts itself against the weight of war. A cowboy offering a seat by the fire. A nurse bowing in gratitude. The exchange of two simple courtesies beneath an endless Texas sky. In the years that followed, those who remembered spoke of that night as if it were a dream, a time when the world, briefly, forgot how to hate. The campfire's glow became a symbol of what could endure even in the darkest hours: respect, warmth, and the recognition that beneath every uniform lies a human being. Today, the wind still moves across the open plains where Camp Swift once stood. The fences are gone, the barracks reclaimed by grass and cedar. But somewhere in that quiet landscape, the echoes remain: the soft strum of a guitar, the murmur of foreign voices, and the word ma'am, spoken with the weight of kindness. It reminds us that history is not only made in battles or speeches, but in moments of grace that defy them. Moments when enemies shared a fire, and, for a fleeting instant, remembered they were both simply human.